So today, on Tuesday, President Bashar al-Assad traveled to Moscow and met with his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin. And this meeting reminds me of the 2015 meeting between Assad and Putin, when Syria formally asked Russia to intervene, militarily intervene in Syria in order to fight with the Syrian army against the radical terrorist groups in Syria. So why I'm saying this? Because in my opinion, this meeting is of the same importance of the meeting that happened in 2015, because this is not only about talking about certain or addressing certain tactical issues in Syria, but rather grand strategic issues. And I'm gonna address in this video why this meeting is very important. This meeting is very important because Russia and the United States have become into certain agreements in the past few months, and specifically at the beginning of July, when Russia and the United States both compromised in the UN Security Council, and they voted again for reopening or extending the humanitarian corridors, especially the Bab al-Hawa border crossing between Syria and Turkey, and from this border crossing that humanitarian aid could come into Idlib. However, what is not being talked a lot about this agreement is that the United States wanted to test the goodwill of the Syrian government, where the Syrian government said, look, you can keep that border crossing open and you can send this so-called international humanitarian aid, but at the same time, I want to also prove that this aid could reach into Idlib. And this is what happened in the past few weeks. Syria allowed, within Syria, through domestic humanitarian corridors for aid to come into Idlib, and there is a change, okay, in the rhetoric and also the actions of both Moscow and the United States, and at the same time this is being translated positively underground in Syria. Now, the United States left Afghanistan, and I mentioned this on my Twitter account, and I think I also mentioned on YouTube. It seems that the decision to withdraw American troops from Syria has been taken, and this could happen next year in 2022, but there should be certain arrangements for this agreement to be implemented properly, because any military evacuation will leave a vacuum, because as we may know, the so-called Syrian Democratic Forces backed by the United States are occupying 30% of Syrian territories, and at the same time they're occupying 50% of Syria's oil and gas revenues, and they're occupying all of Syria's wheat. So there should be certain arrangements for the aftermath of the American withdrawal. But today, when Assad and Putin met in Moscow, first of all, they met 90 minutes alone, head to head, and of course they addressed the strategic points that needed to be discussed and addressed. And then 45 minutes, they also met, but the foreign minister of Syria, Faisal Mekdad, joined, and also the defense minister of Russia, Shoigu, joined, which gives certain signals. Where are we heading to? Because Assad is already the commander-in-chief of the Syrian armed forces, and Faisal Mekdad is the guy of the diplomacy. So I will tell you what they addressed. These are the headlines. We don't know the certain details, but we will definitely know in the near future. As you may know, in Daraa, the southern part of Syria, there are certain arrangements happening now. So in 2018, this area was liberated through reconciliation programs, and Russia brokered this reconciliation between the Syrian government and the so-called rebels or the radical militants. But since then, every few days, attacks happen against the Syrian army, and this area is still out of the control of the government. State institutions didn't return to this area, so the Syrian government insisted that this area should be under full control of the Syrian government. And now Russia brokered another deals with these militants. Some of them were based to Idlib, some others accepted new deals with the Syrian government, where the state institutions have returned into Dar al-Balad, and other suburbs will join this process as well. But it's very important here to mention that Jordan has played a role in this. Jordan is had enough in the past 11 years, and we all know that the government of Syria is not living, and Jordan damaged its own economy by joining the American camp because there is no more trade happening between Syria and Jordan. And worse still is the so-called rebels are attacking from time to time the highways when Syria is trying to do trade with Jordan. So for them, in Arabic we say khalas, enough is enough. And Jordan asked or negotiated with our United States that our national interest, our economic interest is being damaged and we have to restore ties with Syria, and they reopened embassies. The same goes for the UAE. The UAE also played a role with the United States in order to ease this, let's say, the radical policies of the United States in Syria. Now, what after Daraa comes also Israel, because Israel was benefiting from the presence of these so-called rebels, because these rebels were funded and supported also by Israel, and they're proxies for Israel, and they constitute or form some sort of a buffer zone, because the Syrian army cannot move freely in that area in order to form any sort of military establishments or air defenses, or even resistance if they want to liberate, for example, the Golan Heights. But let's remember what Lavrov said, I think 2 or 3 days ago. He said the security of Israel is also a priority for Moscow, and they don't want to cause any sort of military or security tensions now between Syria and Israel. Therefore, this statement comes just after the Daraa deal. So it seems that Syria can guarantee only one thing, which is they could ask Iran and Hezbollah not to be involved in the southern part of Syria, and the conflict with Israel regarding the Golan Heights would be only a Syrian matter and not a matter of an entire alliance of countries or non-state players such as Hezbollah. So the Golan Heights will definitely be a matter for discussion and maybe a conflict with Israel in the future because it's a Syrian territory. But maybe, this is not an information, my analysis, that Syria would guarantee that Iran and Hezbollah would not be intervened in such a conflict if happened in the future. Now, the second point that they have discussed, Putin and Assad, is Idlib. Idlib is the priority. Assad said this a few times. Our priority is Idlib now. And what does that mean? That means, first, the M4 highway that connects Aleppo into the coastal sides of Syria. The thing is with this process of liberating this highway is that Turkey should secure 10 kilometers on the both sides of the highway, and they should create a zone where there are no arms and no terrorists. But Turkey is failing to do so. And also the HTS and other terrorist groups are maneuvering and not implementing this deal. And therefore, the highway is still blocked, and the Syrian government or Syrians cannot use that highway. So the priority, in my opinion, will be the M4 and 10 kilometers on the both sides of the highway. And that explains why the Syrian army sent reinforcement into the axis of Jabal al-Zawiyah a few days ago. So after Daraa, reinforcement will be heading towards Idlib. At the end of the day, those who don't want to implement the deal and the Astana Accords and all the agreements between Iran, Turkey, and Russia in regards to Idlib, they will be targeted through military force, and the Russian Air Force could intervene because this deal should be implemented. But what after M4? Should the Syrian government, or will the Syrian government continue the liberation of entire Idlib? I think the process of liberation of Idlib will be slow. The M4 could be faster, liberating the highway, but the process of liberating the entire Idlib will be slow, and it could take a few years, because we are not only talking about a few thousand Syrian militants, we are talking about tens of thousands of multinational jihadists. Therefore, this area needs an international agreement, because this is not only a Syrian issue. As we may know, Americans consider Idlib the safe haven, or the largest safe haven for Al-Qaeda terrorists in the world. Maybe, just maybe, they should send them to Afghanistan. Maybe that could be a better solution even for these militants, because they share a lot with Taliban, they share a lot with their values, they share a lot with their lifestyle, they share a lot with their regressiveness, so maybe, just maybe, it could be a good solution for them to go to Afghanistan. The third topic on the table of discussion was the eastern shores of the Euphrates. As you may know, eastern shores of the Euphrates, as I mentioned, is occupied by the American forces and American-backed Syrian Democratic Forces, who are the Kurdish militias or the Kurdish separatists. So, in my opinion, the agreement is the Americans will withdraw, but if they withdraw, they will hand over this area not to the Syrian government, but to the Russians. And the Russians have to negotiate again with the Syrian side in order to find certain arrangements with the Kurds there. And when I say the Kurds, this area is only 30% inhabited by the Kurds. Remember that. The majority, the 70% of them are non-Kurdish communities. But because they have the arms and the supporting of the United States, they're presenting themselves as if this area is theirs, which is not. But in my humble opinion, there would be no widespread clashes between the Syrian government forces and the Kurdish militias. But there would be an agreement, because when the Americans withdraw, the Kurds will have no solution but to sit on table with Syria, with Syrian government. And Syria can present only two things to the Kurdish community there. One, more administrative autonomy. And be careful, this is administrative autonomy. We're talking about administrative autonomy that the Kurds can arrange or organize their affairs, the social affairs, the administrative affairs, the cultural affairs there, but there is no political autonomy whatsoever, and federalism, just forget about it. And what can also the Syrian government present is to allow the Kurds to teach the Kurdish language in schools if they want to, so just like the Armenians are able to teach their language in schools. But the difference is, now some may ask, so why the Syrian government was giving this right to the Armenians but not to the Kurds? Two important reasons. This is what the government argues. One, Armenians never asked for separation in Syria. They had over 100,000 Armenian community, and for example, a lot of them used to live in a town called Kesab, and they were able to say, okay, Kesab is ours. We are like 99% of Kesab is Armenians. Let's have our own state there. No, they didn't do that. They were well integrated into the community. And the second reason is, Armenian is the language of the prayer for the Armenians. So if you go to Armenian church, you pray in Armenian. But for the Kurds, if you go to mosque, you pray in Arabic. So this was the two arguments of the government. But the government will, in my opinion, give this right for the Kurds to teach Kurdish if they want to in their schools in eastern shores of the Euphrates. The third and the fourth issues are interconnected. It's the Tanaf border crossing, which is the Americans are occupying. We don't know what's going to happen there, and I'm not going to do analysis before we know what's really is the agreement about. And the other is the Turkish occupation of the north. So after liberating M4, eyes will be moved into the eastern shores of the Euphrates. So the Americans are withdrawing, and Syria will start negotiating with the Kurds to capture this area. And finally, we will see how the Syrian government can deal with the Turkish occupation, because in my opinion, if the Syria and the Kurds, Syrians and the Kurdish militias agree on certain political deals, the pressure will be all on the shoulders of Turkey. Because if you have two of your enemies are united against you, this will be a perfect opportunity for all Syrians, regardless of their ethnicity, to unite against the one enemy, because Turkey is, in my opinion, the gravest danger to the Syrian security and its aspiration of occupation, expansion, not only in Syria, in Iraq, in Armenia, in Cyprus, in Greece, in Central Asia. So you know what's the aspiration of Erdogan. And the fifth issue is Russian investment in Syria, especially in infrastructure and energy. It seems that the Russians will have a biggest share in the oil and gas factories in the eastern shores of the Euphrates, and it will be like a shared exploration and investment there with the Syrian side, and Russia will have the biggest share of this, not having for itself, but investing in this and then distributing it into the Syrian market and maybe also outside, because before the war Syria used to export oil outside the country. And the last thing that Assad and Putin discussed is, it gives you an impression that this is not the priority for them, is the Astana process and also the Constitutional Committee, because the Americans they wanted to form some sort of a constitutional committee. They wanted to reform the constitution and give more autonomy to the Kurds, etc., etc. This is coming just at the end of everything. After all these issues are resolved, this could come just at the end of the issues. Now you may ask why the Americans are all of a sudden change their rhetoric. It's not like they suddenly changed their rhetoric towards Syria, but you have to know that one, militarily they failed in Syria. The Syrian government is there, it's not going to collapse. And their strategy in Syria has failed. Okay, they are able to suffocate the Syrian people through sanctions, but this is not a strategy. You're not gaining anything. You're just blocking your enemy's aspiration and aim to liberate territories or restore normality to Syria, but you're not gaining anything. So this is not a strategy for the Americans, and they don't want to stay in this endless war in Syria. Just like in Afghanistan, it's a non-winnable war. So they withdrew from Afghanistan because one, they didn't succeed, just like in Syria, but two, most importantly, they have other priorities now. As I mentioned a few times, it's Russia and China, and it seems that the process of regrouping is happening, but in the next era we may see non-conventional warfare. It's the cyber warfare. We could see space warfare. We're already seeing this so-called Great Reset and what's happening around the world. So the war against terrorism and regime change has become on the second level of the priorities of the American agenda. It's not like they like the Syrians. First they failed, but the second is their priorities have changed. So this was, in short, a summary of what happened today. It's a very important meeting in my opinion. It's a very strategic meeting, and it will be translated soon underground into hopefully better normality and better life for the Syrians. And I hope that the people understand that the Syrians deserve a better life, right? It's been 11 years of this war, enough with the bloodshed, enough with the sanctions, enough with the sieges and all these inhumane practices that the Americans have implemented in Syria. What's your opinion about this? Do you think that this meeting was of strategic importance, as I believe, or do you think it is less of an importance? And do you believe that the Americans will leave Syria in 2022, as I am expecting, or maybe later or not? Let me know. Let me know your opinion in the comments below, and please subscribe to Syriana Analysis. It really helps me when you do it, and even if you think you are, just check it. And if you want to support Syriana Analysis financially, you can buy me a coffee through Patreon, and you can become a patron. It's really essential for me to survive and bring to you more content like this. And see you next time.